I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Lori Johnson. I'm the president of Maurin Academy. So welcome everybody. If you're new to us, we are a project whose framework is inspired by the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, Peter Maurin. It was a movement that originally sought not only to aid workers in poverty during the Great Depression, but to educate and lead the working class into systems of mutual aid. Our Associated Catholic Worker Farm in Kansas City is our on-the-ground component, and we seek to help people explore the relationship of political, economic, cultural, and environmental and spiritual concerns. We host the speaker series, 2 reading groups, and we teach a variety of courses at very low cost to members of the public who want to learn from thinkers and workers who sought to understand and weather hard times. And we have a few things coming up. Our next speaker in this speaker series will be Eugene McCarraher, the author of The Enchantments of Mammon. That'll be in April. Jacob Honshu, who is on this call, will be leading a reading group on Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of the Enlightenment starting March 19th. I'll be teaching a class on Aristotle's virtue ethics in late May and early June. And Deacon Chris May, one of our almost co-founders, definitely one of our teaching crew, will be teaching a 6-session class this summer on the thought of Ivan Illich. Spencer and I recently interviewed Benjamin Studebaker for our podcast, Decibel Diatribes, and we really enjoyed it. And we're intrigued by his argument of legitimacy in liberal democracies. I felt like it helped explain how we could arrive at a time of such polarization and dysfunction without having any fundamental regime change happen, at least so far. And I expect you'll probably get some questions about that tonight, Benjamin. Benjamin Studebaker is a political theorist with a PhD in politics and international studies from the University of Cambridge. He teaches and publishes in both contemporary political theory and the history of political thought, and is currently working with Theory Underground, a group whose specific aim is to reach the working class with information they can use. Dr. Studebaker's published academic work tends to focus on legitimacy, and his book, published last year, is Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, published by Edinburgh University Press in 2024, November 2024, so very recently. So we want to welcome you, Benjamin, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you guys for having me. This is a book that I really, really enjoy talking about. Legitimacy, for me, is a concept that is often assumed to be about normativity. It's often assumed to be about, what kind of political system should you endorse, or should you support, or should you consider acceptable? But the trouble with framing legitimacy in that purely normative sense is that these arguments in real life also do have a function, which is that if people agree with these arguments, if they believe them, then they actually do go along with the political system in question. They accept it, they endorse it, maybe they tolerate it with some reluctance, but in some way, shape, or form, they actually do contribute in some way to the maintenance of the political system. And for me, this makes legitimacy not something that can be thought of as a purely normative category. There's also this question of whether a particular narrative works, whether it actually performs this function of convincing the audience, whoever that audience might be, however large or small, inclusive or exclusive it might be, to actually do the things that are necessary to maintain the political system. And so for this reason, it's not enough when we talk about legitimacy to simply ask ourselves if we agree with a particular narrative or account of what makes a political system acceptable or unacceptable, just, unjust, good, bad. We also have to think about, can this, in the particular historical moment we're in the specific situation or context that we're in, can it actually perform the function? Can it actually motivate people to act and behave in such a way that the system is able to sustain itself? And that's very tricky because, of course, their willingness to sustain the system will be motivated in part by whether they do normatively agree with the particular narratives that are thrown out to explain the way the political system works. So legitimacy has both this normative aspect and this descriptive aspect. It has both a normative case that it makes, but also this descriptive function that it performs. And so as a concept, it makes it very difficult to cleanly separate oughts from cans. Indeed, it would be kind of pointless to make an argument, even if you think it's true that people ought to endorse a particular regime, if in the time and place in which you live, that argument can't convince anybody. It would not make very much sense to make the argument because the argument has this descriptive function that it's got to perform. Now, in the 20th century, theorists of legitimacy tended to argue that the way that you got major political change was that you would have a society which had a set of values that it believes in, and a state which has a set of values that it defends, expounds, or disseminates throughout society through its activity. But sometimes a split would open up between society and the state, such that the state would cease to be representative of society. Reinhard Koselleck, a German historian, referred to this as a moral dualism that is created, in which the state and society become opposed to one another. And when this opposition happens, it doesn't immediately produce a change. For a while, there's a latent period in which this division is gradually opening up, and there's an opportunity for people to become conscious of the division and to try to do something to rectify it. Now, that could involve the state making an intervention in society to realign society with it. It could also involve the state making concessions to the newly developing values or ideas that are coming out of society. But if the state doesn't make concessions, and if the state doesn't successfully intervene in society to stop society from drifting away from it, then you can get into a situation where this latent crisis escalates, and you have an acute moment where there's an actual revolution or revolt in which there's a real possibility of violence, in which there's an attempt by some part of society to take state power, and therefore a need for the state to act to defend itself and to defend the order that it represents. Now, this kind of theory, I think, was very plausible sounding in the 19th century and the early to mid, maybe even the middle to late 20th century in rich Western democracies. But in more recent years, I think it's become a less plausible theory, at least for certain kinds of democracies, which in my book I call embedded democracies. Embedded democracies are very, very old democracies. And because they're so old, they develop certain idiosyncratic traits. So, for instance, if you have the same political system for a very, very long period of time, it might come to be the case that your national identity is tied in some way to that political system, so that it's hard to imagine being, say, American outside of some sort of commitment to the US Constitution, the Founding Fathers, the American Revolution. To completely negate that would seem in some way to negate being American in and of itself. It makes it more difficult to negate the political system if you view the political system as in some way necessarily tied to who and what you are. The political system is not typically tied to people's identity to anything like that degree. Consider a country like France. In France, you had the ancient regime, then the First Republic, then the First Empire, then a restored monarchy, then the Orleanist monarchy, then a Second Republic, a Second Empire, a Third Republic, the Vichy regime, the Fourth Republic, and then the Fifth Republic. So for much of French history, it was possible to be French while being committed to many different regimes, including monarchy and republicanism, and then multiple different types of republic, multiple different types of monarchy. Indeed, if you were to talk to French people who are interested in restoring the monarchy, they would disagree with each other about which kind of monarchy should be restored. Some of them would be restorationists who think the Bourbons should be restored. Some of them would champion the Orleanist line, and then others would be Bonapartists. And then in addition to that, you've got some French who like the Fifth Republic, some who think it was a mistake to dismantle the Fourth Republic, some who think there's a need for a Sixth Republic. But all of these people recognize each other as French because being French is not tied to a specific regime. And the reason for this is that French regimes have not tended to last long enough for Frenchness to become inextricably bound or linked to any one of these regimes. That is something that can only happen if the political system lasts a very, very long time. Now, in addition to that kind of positive identification, there's also a negative identification, which comes from the regime in your country having outlasted many other competing regimes in many other countries. So in the case of the UK, there aren't very many British people who are extremely enthusiastic about the British political system. Making fun of and criticizing the British political system is very routine and normal in the UK. However, if you ask the British if they would rather have the political system of, say, the French or of the Germans or of, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, then you will all of a sudden discover that the British don't want any of that at all. And they will tend to, at that point, become very defensive about the Westminster system. Not on the grounds that the Westminster system is just or good or wonderful, but that it is proven in some way to be less prone to producing very, very bad outcomes than these other systems that have operated in other European countries. So in that case, you have something like the old Winston Churchill argument that democracy is the worst form of government except for all others that have been tried. And there's a kind of British sense of humor about that kind of remark, a very stereotypically British attitude to the political system, which would not strike us as patriotic, but is quite patriotic in a very strange way. That kind of attitude is only possible because the Westminster system has been in operation in the UK for so long. It's outlasted so many of those French regimes. It's outlasted so many regimes in Germany, so many regimes in Russia. And because it has done that, there is this sense that if you were to change the regime, this would constitute a major risk. Now, we can throw into this picture certain further contingent historical facts. For instance, not so long ago, we had in many parts of the world fascist states and state socialist, communist states that are viewed as having been unsuccessful for all kinds of reasons. The most decisive of which is that these states have collapsed. They don't exist anymore in most of the prominent places where they formerly existed. They're gone. And because they're gone, there's a sense that they don't offer viable alternatives. So if you were to ask people in the United States or in the UK, where in the world is there another regime or another system that is much, much better than the one that you have here, it would be difficult for people to come up with alternative systems that they think would be much better. You might find some people willing to propose various procedural reforms. You might find some people who'd like to change the Electoral College or change the way senators are allocated or make an adjustment to the way the Supreme Court works or to the way, say, the central bank operates, the Federal Reserve. But this would not rise to the level of wanting, say, communism or fascism or wanting the kind of regime that exists in, say, China. We don't have a very large constituency of people who think there's some other much better system out there that could be readily installed in the United States or readily installed in the UK. And so this produces a problem wherein if you reach a point where people are dissatisfied with the kinds of decisions that the state is making, it isn't necessarily going to be clear to them that there is an alternative available that they can simply organize to try to install or to bring into being. And many of our favorite theorists from the 20th century, many people that are deeply respected, major thinkers, operated under the premise that there was real ideological contestation, because there was at the time at which they were writing. There were other regimes that did in fact exist that were plausibly just as good, if not better. And there were lots of people who thought that it might be possible, even insofar as these regimes were flawed, to make them better over time. Till the bitter end in the Soviet Union, there were substantial numbers of people who believed that gradually over time the Soviet Union could be reformed to become the kind of socialist polity that somebody might actually want to live in. It's only when that state collapses that that possibility becomes very difficult to sustain. So I think that when you get the kind of crisis that in the past would have generated this showdown between the state and society, and you're operating in one of these embedded contexts, in that moment when society would have confronted the state, society flinches. Society goes, I'm not sure there's something that I can do here that's going to work. I'm scared that if I try to do something, I will replicate fascism or communism. I don't know how to avoid replicating these things. Many people have tried to bring about better political systems at many times and places. And indeed, you even see this kind of argument in Thomas Aquinas with regard to tyrant slaying. If you slay the tyrant, how do you know that what comes next will be any better? This kind of thinking, you can't really do any better. Whatever you do to try to change the regime will just replicate the same problems and probably make things worse, means that when you get to this moment where you otherwise would have had the showdown, it doesn't happen. And then if the showdown doesn't happen, that means that the movement of the state and society away from each other can continue. It can go further than it would have gone at a point when a revolution would have been the result. And not only can the state and society move further apart, but also the different parts of the state and the different parts of society can potentially move apart. So society and the state can pluralize and start to take on this appearance of not even being a coherent singular thing. And indeed, in the literature today, many postmodernists and constructivists frame the state and society as false abstractions, as kind of false unities that paper over a lot of difference which exists. My contention would be that there is a sense in which this is true. There is an enormous amount of difference that now exists, but that this has happened for specific historical reasons. There are reasons that it now appears to us that the state and society don't have this kind of cogency. And it's because in the absence of this revolutionary clash, of this acute showdown, it then becomes possible for the disagreement to proliferate and deepen and spread to additional areas of social life and political life that in former eras, in former epochs, it would not have been able to touch. Before it would have touched these things, there would have been a revolutionary situation, some possibility of violence, concessions to prevent that from happening. And because there isn't really a possibility of this now, it can be easily taken for granted that the revolution, the showdown, the authoritarian moment won't ultimately come. And this means that politicians are able to take advantage of disagreement, and they're able to actually create more of it and to try to use disagreement as a political tool instead of looking for ways to quiet it down, soothe it, or resolve it before it escalates into something dangerous. Once we recognize that the disagreement is no longer dangerous, it then becomes possible not just to tolerate it, but to continuously feed it without any fear of what might result from doing that. Now, the reason that you would be able to get away with this is that to be able to stage a revolution, you need a certain amount of coherence to your social movement. You don't necessarily have to control a majority of society. You don't necessarily need the allegiance of everybody. You can make a revolution with a minority of people, if that minority is well organized. But if you have this disagreement proliferating throughout all of society and throughout all of the state, you will find that it becomes harder and harder to actually coordinate enough people at either the social level or the political level to create the kind of real acute showdown that's necessary to force meaningful change. And so instead, what happens is that the the language that people used to use to articulate their political demands, this language starts to feel kind of toothless, kind of pointless. Because if the language can't inspire people to engage in some kind of action that threatens the order, then the language can't get the state to make concessions. And the language can't get society to challenge the state. So this means that a lot of the abstractions that are at the center of our legitimating narratives, and here I would include liberal abstractions like liberty, equality, representation. I would also include older, more traditional abstractions like God or nature or the good, or more pragmatic abstractions that are to do more with material conditions like peace, prosperity, or order. These different abstract values that people invoke, if you can't say the state is failing to generate prosperity, therefore we are in position to challenge the state's right to rule, then the state doesn't really have to deliver prosperity. To simply make an argument that what the state is doing isn't delivering prosperity, or to make an argument that the state isn't delivering freedom, isn't delivering equality, isn't delivering justice, isn't acting in accordance with God's will, whichever one of these you might pick, that argument only makes a difference if it actually has the capacity to put the state in some kind of danger, to put the political system in an unsure situation where elites will need to react in some way, or society will be in position to potentially overthrow them and overturn their system. In modernity, we took for granted that this was something that could happen, and theorists assumed it would work. I just don't think it goes through anymore, at least not in these embedded democracies. And this is to say that there are probably states, probably a large number of states around the world that still work in the way that I described in the beginning. There's probably still a large number of states that are still 20th century regimes, in the sense that in these states, if a large gap opens up between the state and society, there's still some possibility of revolution, of a coup, of some kind of confrontation that could result in concessions from the government. This can still happen in many countries in many parts of the world where the political system is younger, less well established, hasn't convinced people that it has this kind of durability or this level of capacity to sustain itself across time. One of the questions that I think is pertinent for future research is that if I'm right that there are embedded democracies, then there's a question of which countries around the world fit in that category and which do not. Because those that fit in that category, political discourse has very different stakes. Language that would be seditious, that would actually threaten the order to such a degree that in previous eras there would be an argument that this speech is dangerous. That language, that same language, would not have that character in an embedded democracy because it wouldn't have the motivational power, the motivational capacity that that language would have had, say, in 1960 or in a state in some other part of the world where the regime is more fragile. So in the book, I argue that there's kind of 4 different levels of legitimacy: perfect, full, minimal, and liminal. Perfect legitimacy being a totally hypothetical situation in which the regime is never challenged. Full legitimacy being a situation where people disagree with some of the decisions that the state makes, with some of the results of the elections, and with, say, some of the decisions the courts issue, but remain committed nonetheless to the procedures. They nonetheless think that the elections are fair. They nonetheless think that the legislative process is acceptable. So they're committed to the rules, even though they don't always like the result. Beneath that, you have minimal. And in minimal legitimacy, you get contestation about the procedures, but a continuing commitment to the regime type. So in this situation, you might want the electoral rules to be reformed, or you might want the way that the courts work to be changed, or the relationship between the elected leaders and the unelected bureaucrats, or the military, or the central bank. You might want to change these kinds of relationships. You might have questions about the relationship between elected figures and technocrats, which I think has become an increasingly popular axis upon which to litigate these procedures. But in this situation, you retain a commitment to the regime type as a type. So in minimal legitimacy, you would remain committed to democracy, even though you would not be sure about the specific procedures that are used to actually try to enact the will of the people. Beneath minimal, you would then get into liminal legitimacy, which would be the case in which the revolutionary possibility asserts, and you actually could have the sharp confrontation. My contention is that in an embedded democracy, you get in a situation where it is not possible to go down to liminal legitimacy, but it's also not possible to go up toward full. You have too much disagreement and too much antagonism for the procedures to generate a wide consensus. Many different parts of society take the view that many different procedures in many different respects are unacceptable. And they all disagree about which procedures are the problem and which procedural reforms are the solution. However, there remains an inability to imagine other regimes that would be better. And so despite this very intense disagreement about what democracy means, it's still not possible to do things that strike people as straightforwardly non-democratic, as straightforwardly outside the box of what democracy means. Now, of course, part of what makes this situation confusing is that if people disagree about how democracy should be procedurally instantiated, then many of the procedural reforms that people propose will look counterproductive to other people. And the easiest way to oppose reforms that you think are counterproductive when you're in minimal legitimacy will be to label those reforms authoritarian and anti-democratic. So the effect of this is that on the one side, we will have a lot of people arguing that the reforms that are being proposed are fascistic in character, that they're a right authoritarian power grab. And conversely, you will have others arguing that other reforms are state socialist or communistic or Stalinist in nature, and that those are also some kind of authoritarian power grab. And what this means is that because each of the reforms is championed by only some part of the population, many other parts of the population will be wound up and terrified and made deeply uncomfortable by the things that are being proposed. And as these disagreements intensify, it will become harder and harder for the participants in the discussion to make themselves understood by one another, so that when, say, the Republicans try to make the case that their reforms to the civil service are consistent with democracy, not only will they be disagreed with, but it will be believed that they're operating in bad faith, that their arguments are a kind of deception which is really intended at bringing about some kind of authoritarianism. And any fringe figures, any particular individuals associated in any way with the Republicans who have in any way, shape, or form taken positions that seem clearly authoritarian get framed as the actual masterminds behind the entire movement. And by the same token, the same thing occurs in the opposite direction. So when the Democrats are in power in the United States and they propose various kinds of procedural reforms, or where the progressive wing of the Democratic Party proposes various kinds of procedural reforms, those reforms are labeled as communistic. And not only are the Democrats and the progressives not understood by those who disagree with them, but they're accused of operating in bad faith and of trying to bring about some kind of Stalinism through the back door. The effect of this is that everyone will be concerned about authoritarianism during this period of minimal legitimacy, even though the reason that everyone is concerned about authoritarianism is that nobody wants it. So the superabundance of concern about authoritarianism is actually the best evidence that it's not going to happen, because it's the number one thing everyone doesn't want, and it's the most effective way of blocking anything that you don't like. To me, that's quite strong evidence that we remain at the minimal level of legitimacy, and we have not gone down into the liminal level. But of course, if you have a particular view about democracy that's quite strong, if there's a specific set of procedures that you think are the right procedures, and you're quite convinced that somebody else is proposing the wrong procedures, from your point of view, it is going to look like there's some kind of authoritarian threat menacing us. And it's going to be really difficult for me or for anyone else to change your mind about that by drawing attention to how the other people think. I'll sound like a useful idiot to you if I try to explain what the other people think on their own terms. So it won't be possible for us to have a communication about this which calms us down, not at scale at least. And so therefore, I think that this kind of crisis can go on for a very long time because as it continues to go on, we don't have a dialogue which enables us to rectify the disagreements. And then in the absence of any kind of showdown that would compel a response, the disagreements just intensify further and further. And to make matters worse, it starts to become advantageous for political actors to exploit the disagreement in ways which make it worse. So when you're in a situation where there's a very large block of the population that's relatively unitary that you can attempt to win over electorally, then it makes sense to try to build consensus. And not so very long ago, 40 or 50 years ago, it was routine for politicians to talk about the swing voter, the voter who might vote for one of these parties at one point and a different party at another point. That's no longer the preferred strategy of election strategists. Instead, now they look for the fringe voter, the person who sometimes doesn't vote. If they do vote, there's only one party they're likely to vote for. But whether they vote has a lot to do with whether they feel energized. And this energy is often a negative energy. It's often a fear of what the other party will do. So for this reason, politicians and political strategists are working very hard to persuade the fringe voters that they think they have a chance of winning, that there's an emergency situation that demands that they come out and vote this time. Because if they don't vote, then authoritarianism will take place. And so this has given politicians an incentive to dramatically inflate the scale of whatever it is that they're facing, and to frame any reform proposal that anybody throws out as incredibly insidious and potentially very evil. A straight conversation about what would these procedural reforms actually do, and do we want them to do what they would do, has become really, really difficult to have. And I think this is in part because if we were to try to just have a conversation about what we value or what we would like to see happen, we'd find that the abstractions that tend to be at the center of legitimation stories, that we don't agree about which abstractions are important. And even insofar as we do agree, we don't understand these abstractions in the same way. In the book, I argue that a legitimation story has three parts. There's what the story is meant to explain, so the action or inaction or the particular feature of the order or the system or the way things are that has been challenged, has been called into question. Then the abstraction, the value, understood in a kind of open apophatic sense, that is invoked to explain that situation or that action or decision, right? I call that the legitimating abstraction. And then the conceptualization, the specific application of that abstraction to that situation so that the story or narrative makes sense to the audience. So for instance, if you say that you are negotiating with Russia, and people go, why are you negotiating with Russia? You might say, it's because I care about peace. I'm trying to make peace. Now, peace is a big open abstraction, and there's a question about what should that mean, and whose peace, and what kind of peace is the right kind of peace. And there's all sorts of arguments we could have about what peace should be taken to mean in relation to the situation in Ukraine. To make the story work, this peace will have to be concretized. It will have to be made to mean something in particular in relation to the situation in Ukraine. So the questions that get asked when the president says he wants to do a deal to accomplish peace is, well, what will that peace involve? And so he'll have to conceptualize peace in relation to that situation to make that legitimation story compelling. And because there's been so much disagreement, and this disagreement is worsening all the time, it's very, very difficult to envision any possibility of him conceptualizing peace in such a way that the overwhelming majority of people in the country will recognize him as having delivered on an acceptable peace. Almost no matter what he does, sizable groups of people will regard this as not real peace, or they will say that the peace that he's pursuing is not worth risks to other abstractions that for them are more important in relation to this question, like, for instance, freedom or the prosperity of the Ukrainians, which they might imagine might be higher in the event that the war is continued, although it might also be much lower if the war is continued, depending on what you think the likely consequences of continuing the war would be. So even with a concept like peace, which we often think of as tied very concretely to specific material conditions, I think we're seeing right now in relation to this discussion that it's a very contentious concept. And the same is also true with respect to Gaza and the ceasefire in Gaza. What does peace mean there? Because while lots of people might say that they'd like to see peace happen, there is disagreement on what priority peace should have vis-a-vis the other values, other goals that people have with respect to these cases. And then there's disagreement about how to conceptualize peace, how to define it in relation to these situations. The same thing is true for all of those other legitimating abstractions that I laid out: liberty, equality, and representation, peace, prosperity, and order, God, and nature. We're not going to be able to agree on which of these are the most important in any given situation, and we're not going to agree on how best to conceptualize them in relation to any given situation. And so what this means is that politicians are not going to be able to generate broad and deep consensus by invoking these abstractions. The standard technique of telling a story where you straightforwardly explain what you've done in terms of a value that everyone shares, so that everyone then recognizes, well, of course, that was the thing that needed to be done. We all care about this value. That won't go through. And instead, what will happen is that politicians will have to tell lots of stories to different audiences to try to generate enough support to be able to do the things that they want to do. And these stories will be in tension with each other. They'll tend to conflict with each other in various ways. And if the same politician tells multiple stories at once, it's liable that that politician in the age of mass media will be caught out and labeled a hypocrite. So in practice, it will be more effective for these stories to be told by many different people. And in the book, I call this impersonal hypocrisy. So impersonal hypocrisy is a condition that results from this crisis in which all of the politicians believe themselves to be sincere. They all say, this is what I think should happen. And I think it should happen because I value this abstraction. And this abstraction clearly relates to this situation for these reasons. They're all sincere in what they say. Nevertheless, because there are too many of them with too many different preferred abstractions, which they understand in too many different ways, when they try to get the state to act on the basis of any of their particular narratives, they find that they can't get enough people to act with them. So they repeatedly tell their supporters, if you vote for me, if you donate to me, if we win enough elections, I'll be able to do this thing that we all want to see done. So for instance, in the case of Bernie Sanders, Medicare for all, right? If enough people come out, if enough people vote, if enough people donate, eventually we'll win enough elections and this will happen. The trouble is that there are just too many different divisions for this to go through. And so even though Bernie Sanders is entirely sincere, I think, in pursuing that strategy, it's nonetheless the case that that can't really be achieved during this kind of crisis, at least not without some major change to the way the entire crisis is operating. And so for that reason, the political system comes to have this feeling of being very deceptive and kind of vampiric. These politicians are constantly trying to get you to do things and participate and struggle together with them, but none of them are actually able to operate the system and make it do the things that they say they would like to see done. So it seems like they're repeatedly conning you in various ways. But they can all be entirely personally sincere. Indeed, in this kind of crisis, you would have to be a little bit credulous to become a politician, because you would have to think that you were going to get somewhere by doing that. So the kinds of people who choose to run for office in this kind of crisis tend to be people who don't fully understand the degree to which this system is locked up in this particular moment. So for this reason, I think that people tend to become frustrated with the system, and they tend to drop out of it. And they tend to drop out and go through periods of deactivation. And this is the sense in which they're fringe voters. They go through periods where they go, it doesn't matter if I participate because nobody can do anything. Nobody's going to do anything for me. And they decide to become much less involved in politics. And when they're doing this, they go into what I call the enclavist zones, the other zones of life, the other things that you can be involved in or focus on as alternatives to being very much focused on politics. And these are all valid things to care about, and they're all major parts of all of our lives. But in the book, for the purposes of discussing legitimacy, my focus is on how they provide an alternative to politics that is not completely an alternative, because, of course, none of these things is entirely independent from politics or entirely immune to the effects of political decision-making. So these would be the four Fs: faith, family, fandoms, and futurism. And each of these four things is in various ways penetrated by politics. In the case of faith, many churches become involved directly in politics. Many pastors, many religious figures are interested in getting involved in politics and in getting their churches involved in politics in various ways. In the case of family, it becomes economically difficult for people to sustain viable family structures, and this compels them to look to politics potentially as a mechanism for shoring up the sources of support for their preferred family structures. It also becomes an issue in terms of the education of their children, if they have children, to find some kind of affordable mechanism for doing that in a context where the resources from the state to fund education are increasingly stretched thin. In the case of fandoms, there is a tendency for the same kinds of representational debates, cultural disputes that infect political life to also come into the fandoms. So you might think that, say, you're getting into Star Wars so that you don't have to deal with political disputes, but what you'll find is that people begin making demands that the Star Wars franchise become political in various ways, that it take up particular kinds of political positions, or political positions are attributed to it no matter what it does, so that it's impossible to avoid these kinds of debates or to avoid taking positions in them. And then in the case of futurism, these companies that position themselves as offering a kind of private sector path to a better life, a better future, if they, insofar as they are successful, they inevitably become embroiled in regulatory contests. The things that they do inevitably have political stakes. And sooner or later, the people who run these companies end up drawn back into politics. And as they're drawn back into politics, the people who have followed them and become focused on them as an alternative source of belief in a hopeful future, those people too are drawn back into politics along with them. Elon Musk being a very prominent recent example, but even guys who, until recently had tried pretty hard to stay out of politics are now increasingly drawn into it. Jeff Bezos with the Washington Post recently, and then also Mark Zuckerberg, who has been much more avowedly interested in trying to take out a particular position with regard to speech on Facebook. So even though people go to these places to have an area of social life that is not affected by the spiraling disagreements that are shot through the political, they're liable to find that these zones of life also in various ways become more fragile, more precarious, and more difficult to manage as the political situation deteriorates. And so for this reason, I think that in this kind of crisis, we go through kind of four different moods, and we don't necessarily go through them in a particular order, and we can potentially, move back and forth quite a bit. But four different moods that we go through in life. One, which I call the conservative mood, is a desire for older legitimation stories. So legitimation abstractions that have tended to be deprioritized in more recent years or more recent centuries, and for conceptualizations of legitimation stories that prevailed 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, and now don't have the same level of centrality. So a desire for the state to speak in the kind of language that it spoke to people in the past in, or to speak in that language to a greater degree than it does now. That would be the conservative mood. The liberal mood would be the mood of wanting the state to update some of its legitimating abstractions, to move newer abstractions more to the center of the discussion, or to conceptualize legitimation abstractions in new ways. So to understand freedom or to understand equality in a new way, maybe to understand equality as equity instead of as equality was traditionally understood in the last, say, 200, 250 years. This is a desire for an update in the narratives, for an update in the stories, rather than going back to a set of stories that were previously prevailing. But sometimes we get to a point where we are frustrated, not just with the stories the state used to tell or with the stories the state is starting to tell, but with all of this storytelling, which seems not to actually improve our lives ultimately. And when we feel this way, we get into the negative mood. And the negative mood is the mood in which we become deeply estranged from and alienated from the political system. And insofar as we stay in the negative mood, it could potentially compel us to do some kind of organizing, I think, for some other kind of way of living. It could compel us to develop other kinds of visions for what politics or social life could mean. The thing is, there's so much disagreement and so much splintering now that it's very difficult to organize with people on either a social or a political level. So this means that being in a negative mood tends to be very psychologically difficult. We tend to really struggle to get very far while we're in the negative mood. And so being in the negative mood for a long time can be dangerous. It can be harmful to your health. And so for this reason, people tend to exit the negative mood. And then the enclavist mood, the mood where we really put at the center of our lives faith, family, fandoms, and futurism, and we try to exclude the political and forget about it, that becomes, I think, a very prominent mood that many of us spend a significant part of our lives in. And so a human life in an embedded democracy becomes a movement among these moods. And it's a movement that can occur in different years of your life, different decades of your life. It might also be something you experience at different times in the day or in reference to different political issues. There may be times in the day where you are in a conservative mood with respect to specific issues, and then at some other point in the day, you're in a liberal mood. I think a lot of people are not very ideologically consistent or very mood consistent with respect to these things. So I wouldn't want to treat them as, solid, hard categories that you simply slot people into, and then those people are in those categories for the rest of their lives, or even for the rest of the day in some cases. People do tend to move around, and one of the things that politicians try to do is to switch which mood people are in, and to get people out of one of the moods and into another one of the moods. And this is something that I think does happen, and does happen with a significant amount of frequency. In particular, people are often dragged out of the enclavist mood and back into the conservative mood or the liberal mood on the basis of some social or cultural issue which affects their enclave. And so acts as a magnet and pulls them out of the enclave and reactivates them politically. And indeed, there has been an increasing amount of active research by political strategists about how this can be done. How do you take something which has previously not been a major football in politics and code it as a left thing or a right thing so that you can create this attachment and association and get people who were previously disengaged from politics back into it. And I see this happening on all kinds of different social issues. Many, many things that we would never have thought of as political issues seem to be becoming political, often in a way that strikes us as absurd, at least at the beginning, but then becomes normal over time. One that would stick out to me would be the question of pets. Pets have seem to have become a very coded issue in recent years, where we have the Pope condemning childless people for adopting pets rather than adopting human babies, which he did a few years ago. And then we also have, Kristi Noem, the governor of, I believe, South Dakota, who was looking to become the vice president, but she killed a family dog because, in her view, it was dangerous to her children. And because she did this, she's viewed as callous and having been not having treated the dog as appropriately as a member of her family. We had in the UK when the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak was struggling in the polls, he tried to regain popularity by announcing a ban on the XL bully dog, and he pinned to the top of his Twitter for over a month a video of him condemning XL bully dogs. So I've noticed that there does seem to be, even with pets now, this idea that it's right-coded to have a family pet or a work pet, but it's left-coded to have a pet in place of a human relationship, say in place of a spouse or in place of children. And so if you have a pet and you're in one of those situations or the other, you're invited to identify politically on the basis of this. And it's something that I think would have struck us as absurd and may still, I hope, strike us as a little bit absurd today. But yes, childless cat lady J.D. Vance would be an extremely recent example of it. Yep. This seems to be everywhere lately, all over the place. And it is, for me, a prominent example of this kind of tendency that I think we're only going to see more and more of as these divisions have to be replicated in more and more places so as to mobilize people to get back into politics in defense of whatever it is that they've managed to find that has given them any protection or any comfort from the ways in which this political system has become increasingly, for many people, terrifying, because for many people there is this acute sense that some kind of authoritarianism is menacing them. And I suppose, what I can offer is this much of a reassurance that I do not think we're going to see any kind of authoritarianism that would unambiguously strike the vast bulk of people in our society as authoritarianism. So this would mean that the things that almost everyone's conception of democracy excludes will remain excluded. Things like, for instance, getting rid of competitive multi-party elections. I would say that there's going to be midterm elections and that Democrats and Republicans will both have real chances of winning those elections. And that has to happen because if that didn't happen, that would be too much outside the democracy box. It would strike too many people as not at all compatible with democracy. Even procedural reforms that many of us would say, well, whether I agree with that or don't agree with it, there are certainly some democracies around the world that have that procedural structure. Many of those reforms strike many, many, many people in our country as potentially authoritarian reforms. And for that reason, it's really difficult, even for relatively mild or moderate reforms, to be enacted, much less something straightforwardly authoritarian. So I think with that, I think it's a good opportunity to go to questions. In particular, if people have certain concerns about certain types of reforms that maybe have been in the news lately, I'm happy to offer my take with the caveat that on my own theory, it will be difficult for me to explain the reforms that other people want in such a way that I don't just seem credulous to you if they're reforms that you very, very sharply oppose. And this would be the case regardless of, a few years ago during the Biden administration, it would go the opposite direction to every bit the same degree. I am just as happy to talk about reforms preferred by the left as preferred by the right. I'm not trying to defend any particular faction's procedural reforms. One of the things I say in the book, kind of from the outset, is that for the purposes of this book, I myself am trying very much to put to one side what it is that I actually feel about all of this. Because I think if I bring too much into this theory, my own specific values, my own preferred abstractions and preferred conceptualizations of those abstractions, it will cause me to view all of this in a way that would make it harder for me to get at what I'm trying to get at, to describe what I'm trying to describe. So in the same spirit, for the purposes of this, I will to a large degree bracket my own preferred abstractions and preferred conceptualizations thereof.